So the last talk for this session is by Curtis Maloney. He fell in love with Python back at version 1.5 and apparently never looked back. And he's on Freenode in the Django channel, apparently not just as a single person, but rumors say a bunch of people spread across the whole world. So he's doing good there. And he will tell us about the current state of the Django REST Framework ecosystem. Give him a warm welcome, please.
I'm going to start by apologizing for the very rough format of this. I was kind of brought in as a gap filler, but I did have more notice than some people, it seems. Can I have a quick show of hands of anyone here who actually does hang out on the Django channel on Freenode? You're all missing out. You really are. No, lots of the core developers hang out there, lots of really experienced people, and it's a great part of the community that just loves to help out. All right. First truth about REST frameworks, we don't really have any. Everybody knows about TastyPie, and I'm sure you've heard of Django REST Framework, but when it comes down to pure REST, they're not. But they are really useful, and they do really save you a lot of time. So, oops, this is me. Yep, I started using Django pretty much about the time it came out. It completely blew away a project I was working on at the time, which is kind of developing an integrated ORM and web app construction framework. And we saw Django and just went, we've been wasting our time. So we switched over and started using it. More recently, I've given back to the community a couple of tools. One is django-nap, which is my own API tool. So full disclosure here, that's mine. I'm putting it in here because I think it's worthwhile for the comparison more than anything else. I've also recently released Django Rated, which is a rate limiting tool, could be very handy, and that's actually part of the talk as well. Probably the most important thing I do most of my time, I've spent most of my work through Common Code working on the Kogan website. Has anyone been to the Kogan website? That's our fault. Did anybody hear about the IE7 tax? We enjoyed writing that a lot more than you enjoyed reading about it. We got to do that. They came in, they said, please do this. And we went, you bet, we'll stay. Late night, doesn't matter, we'll do it. Come on, let's go. And there was a bug in that Microsoft found, ironically. So we fixed it, did another release, and started taxing people. That's the bit I always found strangest. People actually paid the tax. I'm going to be comparing three of the major API frameworks, not REST frameworks, although they'll all call themselves that. They're API frameworks because really they're building RPC frameworks. There's TastyPie, which is version 0.9.16 now, and that's been around for quite a while. It's the oldest one that's still being developed, and there's about 2,100 people following it on GitHub. So it's pretty popular. And how many people here use TastyPie? There's quite a few of you. Not surprising. Why? Because it works. You drop it in, bang, you've got an API. It doesn't take much. And it has everything. All the features you think about, and all the features that your manager is going to ask you to tick the boxes on, it's got. It's got some lurking horrors as well. Django REST Framework, not long ago, went and overhauled themselves with version 2.0, and that was a big change. Now they've got to 2.3, and they're based on the idea of here's a serializer class for turning my data to and from a flattened format that I can actually hand off over the wire. And here's a bunch of class-based views that you can build your API from. Very different to TastyPie. And then there's my own little nap, which was basically built on the idea of TastyPie was too big and slow and clumsy for what we were doing. It really was slow. As the last person said, the serializer takes a lot of time. We found it took too much time. And I had this sort of half-assed, lightweight mini serializer for cases where we needed to serialize but not do a whole API. And I built that up, plugged in a publisher model that I had sitting around from a project a few years ago, and now we've completely removed TastyPie and supplanted it with Nap. And we're not looking back. As you can see from the little numbers on the end, it doesn't quite rate as much interest as the other two projects, but it's young times. These are the main features most people are really going to be interested in when looking at one of these API frameworks. I think it's all pretty obvious what they are, except for maybe shapes. Shapes is basically sending your data different formats, different number of fields, different shapes of data, depending on which part of the API you're calling. Rate limiting, obviously we all know we need that. Filtering, API versioning, and use in views at the bottom there is when you want to try and use the serialization formats and all the rest of the wonderful things that the API has given you in your own views, not in the API views. So I'm going to try and address all of these for each of these functions. Authentication is basically, who are you? Surprisingly large number of people get this confused with authorization. That comes later. TastyPie has a nice big selection. You can got HTTP basic and digest support with all the little caveats for if you're using mod WSGI. API key, they've got their own API key implementation, so you can go and ask for key and pass it along. Normal Django authorization, OAuth 1.0a, which is the one we all know is good enough and not completely broken. And then good hooks for plugging in your own authorization, or authentication. It's not hard at all. Django REST Framework, pretty much the same selection, but it does have OAuth 2, but, well, I don't know how many people have seen the fuck OAuth 2 video. Yeah, very educational, and it's why I try to stay away from OAuth 2. They can do HTTP digest, but you need an extra parties tool to do that. NAP has none of that, because it's not a NAP's place to do that. It's there to take most of the drudge work out of getting an API over the line. You've got authentication stuff. You already have all those tools. You do it your way. Authorization. May I do this? Am I allowed to go and ask for this data or change that data or whatever? In TastyPie, there's this fixed authorization provider interface. It basically gives you CRUD and list and detail. That's your hooks. That's all you can do. Which, in theory, in a pure REST sense, is all you need. Django REST Framework, on the other hand, you have a global default, or you can share some, or you can change it per view as to how you apply your authorization. And it basically has two calls, has permission and has object permission, where you get past the request, the view, and potentially the object, so you can apply whatever style of authentication under whatever conditions that you think is needed, an authorization. You can choose. Do I care that they're calling the get link? No, anyone can do that, but if this person is calling that view, I want to do something different. NAP has a very simple permit decorator where you pass it a test function. The test function gets passed everything that's going to get passed onto the handler, so that you can just say, okay, is the user logged in? Are they in this group? There's some sample ones that come along that make it easy to do those ones. But again, NAP's job isn't to try and re-implement somebody else's authentication machinery. You've got that. Data formats. How can we talk over the wire? And I absolutely agree that you should use as few as possible in your particular application. We can see that TastyPie has certainly the largest set. Django REST Framework comes with all the ones we actually care about, and YAML. And NAP currently supports, it'll always support HTML out of the box, only as a sort of a fallback if you didn't say the actual format you were using. It has JSON and message pack, because I thought message pack actually looks like it could be really handy. And you can plug in more later on. The biggest difference is TastyPie and Django REST Framework can support lots of different formats at the one time. NAP will only support one at a time, and HTML. Serializer, how to turn your object into data you can pass across the wire and back again. Or as my dad used to say, you've turned your avocado into guacamole, can you now turn your guacamole back into the avocado? The main differences are that TastyPie is monolithic. When you've got your resource, that is your serializer and your views all in one piece. There's no separating them, very little control over how that goes. Whereas Both Django REST Framework and NAP, you get a standalone serializer class that you define and you can use wherever you need it, and then a separate way to actually publish and accept data using that. When it comes to statefulness, in Django REST Framework, the serializer, you create one per record. You force the data in there and then say, give me the object out, or you put the object in and ask for the data out, but you have to create one per record. With TastyPie and NAP, you just create one and use it for all of them, which can be, there's pros and cons on both, of course, but being stateless immediately makes you much easier to be thread safe. But I don't think that's really much of an issue in most of the way that these end up getting used. The last bit is the pattern for getting your object back. TastyPie, I wound up having a lot of trouble when we used it first. Basically, you have to be able to instantiate your object and then set all the properties on it. And I found this very limiting in particular areas of our code. Whereas Django REST Framework and NAP, because I stole the idea from Django REST Framework, you have to write a restore object method that gets past the reinflated data, and then it's up to it to do whatever it wants. And most of the time, you'll just pass it onto your object and go, splot, there's the data. But maybe you want to do something different. The choice is yours, it's there. Shapes. TastyPie accepted a patch from me a year ago on being able to specify in each field in your data format, do I want this to appear only in list format, only in detail format, or in both? And that's as much as they've got so far, from what I've seen, of being able to control which fields are where. We had a case where some of the fields were really expensive to generate. We needed to leave them out of the list view, but we needed them in the detail view. And their other alternatives weren't very good. Django REST Framework and NAP allow each view to choose which serializer it's going to use, so you have absolute control over the shape of your data for every single view. Pagination. TastyPie uses its own custom pagination function. They've got a custom class and they've got extension API so that you can go and write your own. I'm not really clear on why they went that path, although they do show in the comments in the code that it does have some advantages for the way they want to use it. It does get more flexible. Django REST Framework and NAP both use the pagination that's already built into Django. Why wouldn't you? Well, one reason is you can't actually say, I want to look at, if you have a page size of 10 objects, but you want to start 5 objects in, Django pagination doesn't really like that very much. It wants to go n pages in total. And so you really have to go page granular. So whilst in Django REST Framework, you can just go, okay, I want a page size of 15 and I want page 7, and that's what you get. In NAP, you can also say, I want to start at offset 17, and it'll actually round that to the nearest page for you. There's also options to say the maximum page size you can ask for, because in all cases you can actually say, I want you to change your default page size to this. But if somebody comes along and says, I want page size to be 1 million, suddenly you've got a denial of service problem. So there are limits. I know that NAP has it because I wrote it. I know that anybody else has actually gone, we should really cap that. Rate limiting. Both TastyPie and DRF have their own rate limiting tools built in. And they're hooked in quite neatly into the infrastructure. In NAP, I thought, why are we doing this? We need rate limiting on more than just our APIs. So I split that task off into something else, and that's where Django Rated came from. It's somebody else's job. And you'll probably notice this is a common pattern in what I'm saying about NAP. Somebody else's job. Let somebody else solve that problem. Make it possible to hook it in, use all the existing framework, but don't step on other people's toes. Django REST Framework's documentation alone on their rate limiting surpasses all the rest. It was very easy for me to go along and see that their rate limiting was very flexible. Very easy to come along and say, I want by default this specification, I want for this API, I want it to be this particular, and you can have different settings depending on whether it's a particular user or anonymous. So you can have authenticated users have a much higher limit. Filtering is the interesting part where, obviously you don't always want to see all of your objects, and you just suddenly think, hang on, do I need some special way to explain to my API tool how to filter the objects, or should I just use Django's expressions? Well, both TastyPie and Django REST Framework come along and allow you to declare what is permissible to filter on. And then there are hooks inside them, of course, that you can go and apply your own filters any way you like. It doesn't matter, but they supply some pluggable options for choosing how the filtering is going to work. Of course, everybody supports the ORM because this is Django. You've got to filter the ORM. But they give you the option of saying, look, I'm just going to follow the common pattern of how we're going to apply filters on various fields. But I only want people to be able to filter on these fields because they're the ones that make sense. I don't want people to start plumbing around and diving through my relations and guessing at what other objects are and starting to really pull out data that I don't want them to know. Nap, once again, doesn't actually do it for you, but does give you the hook of where you would obviously go in and say, okay, now I'm going to implement my filters. I'm planning on extending that API somewhat, but I haven't had a need for it yet. We've got, in the case of Kogan, there is one API that does a lot of heavy filtering, and I built up a couple of simple wrappers to let it do it. API versioning is something that actually Django REST Framework kind of sidestepped. They took an interesting approach to it. Nap and TastyPie let you take a bunch of resource definitions, or publishers as they are in Nap, and collect them together into a container that will just say, I'm version 1. And when your interfaces change, you write new resources and tie them together into a new API and say, publish that as version 2. Really all it is a way of collecting them together and putting a prefix on their URL. But again, because we've got URL patterns and URL names and so on, you can use that to reverse them and go, okay, I want that version of the API, I want that method on it, get me the URL for that. In Django REST Framework, they have things called a view set, which is basically a way of saying, here's how you list, create, update, delete, do all the things you want to do, and any other actions on your objects that you want. And then you have a router into which you plug that, which says, when someone wants this resource and they do a get, you actually call that method on the view set. So in effect, the router allows you to do API systems by remapping any particular request onto a specific action on the view set, but you don't explicitly, they don't have a concept like the other two do of the API versioning. Generic views, TastyPie has none because it's built around the idea of you have the resource and the resource is everything, which you can extend your resource and start calling some of the hooks inside it, but you don't get any sort of generic views to allow you to continue doing any work. Nap, I plan to extend it to, but I'm sort of wondering about that after the research on this, because Django REST Framework has lots of them, and it has mix-ins. They went ballistic as far as supporting generic class-based views. There are a bunch of mix-ins, a bunch of concrete classes, and you can extend the basic view yourself and go anywhere you want. We all know how much power and danger is involved in generic class-based views, and they've realised the same thing. Where this comes out to be interesting is when it comes to trying to use those other resources in your own views. With TastyPie, it can be kind of clumsy. This is a view that I've adapted from something we used to do of trying to show a list of objects, or at least serialize a list of objects and pass it on to a template to render, because we found this was actually a lot of times just easier than replicating the code that was already in the API for the filtering and the testing. But it's actually about 90% of one of the methods that is already on the resource. But you can't use that directly because it will automatically create a formatted either JSON or XML and so on review response. So you have to copy this and chuck it into your own view. And that's quite a lot of code there, and that's actually been slightly optimized compared to what they have in their code, which is more readable. But Django REST Framework, it's built in. It's how you use it. I mean, the start of their tutorial is how to use their serializers in your views. And as you saw before, they have lots of generic views for you to use, so it's not hard to go. It's just natural for the course. In NAP, it's kind of easy. It's certainly a lot fewer lines than it was in TastyPie, but it is still a little bit onerous. One of the interesting things in here is, and I got this bit of code actually donated to me from another Django aficionado, Schinkel, who does a few very common tools. He's created a set of HTTP response classes that also extend exception. So at any point in your code, you can raise an HTTP response and suddenly say, all right, I want to bail out of here, I'm all done, I've got a response, we've got to get this out of here. And so that's how you can just tunnel up through however many layers you're in and throw any sort of response that you want. And there's a nice big collection of all the different standard HTTP responses as exceptions. Now, I've talked with some of the core developers about their views on this, and basically they don't like binding the exception to the response because then you're binding the intent to the actual reaction. It would be much better to have, for instance, the separation of not found and a 404 response. I've gone through this a lot quicker than I expected, but I will actually cover a couple of interesting features on a few of these things and some feedback I've got from various people about using it. TastyPie, for one, gives you a very, very quick way to say, take my object, my model, make it available to the world. But once you want to go past that, you start getting bogged down. You have to learn a lot of its internals. They're not necessarily as clearly documented as you want. And whilst there are a lot of hooks in there for getting in and modifying things at various stages of the behavior, it still can be very, very cumbersome to go in there and do your own thing. django-nap has a publisher model that I mentioned earlier, and basically it's very similar to the views and routing in DRF. There are a bunch of basic standard URL patterns that it defines, and then it'll try and find the method on the class to handle the request. So the methods basically go list or object, HTTP verb, so get, post, delete, whatever, and then the action that was in the URL, or if there wasn't an action, default. So just asking for the root of that API would end up calling list get default function. And that would be responsible for generating the response. It makes it very easy for you to decide, okay, this API needs a jiggle call on the object. So you write object get jiggle as your method, and it gets past the response and all the request objects and so on. And it has the sole job of handing back all the responses. We actually found, when transferring from TastyPie to NAP, that there were code sections that translated very neatly onto the publisher model without actually being API functions. There was no serializer involved. There was no actual JSON or XML or API calls as such, but there are a bunch of related views that all needed common infrastructure and just different ways to hook out to get them. So we found that it's really a pattern very much like class-based views for sharing your code without actually being individual class-based views inheriting from the same base class. Instead, you have put them all into one class and then route the request to where it goes. Django REST Framework's routers and such have a very similar idea, and you allow people to say, this is a method I want to expose, the router in the API set, and then the router gets told you call that one when somebody calls get on this action or post on this object and so on. Right. I'm not sure how far I've gone through, but...
About a minute.
Right. Any questions?
All right.
TastyPie has a hypertext as the engine of application state concept. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and
Well,
if positive, whether they exist in the other two frameworks.
We always found we had to turn off the include IRI, object IRI, just to get any decent performance. Otherwise, there was too many calls to reverse. It is there, and the idea is nice, but from a pragmatic point of view, nobody really uses it. I mean, in theory, you should be able to look at an object and know where to find it by its IRI, and not be able to guess it from a URL pattern, but we're all using fixed URL structures. So it kind of breaks down there. And I was talking with some other people this weekend about this, and they were saying that they've got cases where, although it's technically correct to store the URL or the IRI of that object in order to reference it, you're better off just storing the ID. So that is actually one of the features in Django REST Framework that I skipped over. They actually provide you with a nice, neat way to look at your API from a web page. So if you hit the API, it will come up and say, oh, here's the list. It's got these fields. I'm going to tell you about it if you're using just a web browser. So you can navigate and interact with your API from a web browser and without having to have JavaScript to do it. NAP provides an introspection endpoint on the API, only if you've got an API wrapping, a versioning API wrapping all your resources, and it will run through and show you what methods you can call and what actions you can take. But Hatios is a nice theoretical concept, but I think most people realise that in practice we're not there yet. Anyone else?
Any more?
I think you said for NAP there is the ability to like prune the number of fields that are returned in list view or in the like the detailed object view. Can the client?
Sorry, I think that was TastyPie. You don't have a lot of control over the fields.
Right. Well, in the case of NAP, then
in NAP you choose the serializer, just like
yeah.
REST
But so
framework.
can the client tell the server I want these fields and I don't want these fields and I want basically this representation of the resource? So can the client include stuff that you by default leave out, for instance?
There's not direct support for that at the moment. There is a model serializer factory, which is used for creating related object lists, where if you just say, look, I want to include a list of these objects of this model, and it'll go, well, you didn't tell me how to serialize it, so I'll go and create one myself. And the same idea could be applied at the lower level and create just a normal serializer like that, but there isn't, I haven't seen that support in any of them yet. It's a nice idea, but...
I know, like Google does it, and a lot of other sort of public APIs give clients the ability to like tailor the size of the response by give me the full name of this user object that otherwise I wouldn't be getting back, stuff like that, and maybe even traverse it, right? So you're getting resource type A, which has foreign keys, obviously, other stuff. By default, you wouldn't be serializing all those foreign keys, I hope, but maybe you allow your client to say, well, this foreign key also include like the name of the user that is the publisher of this blog post, something like that, right? But fair enough.
As I said, I haven't seen any actual explicit support for doing that. I definitely see the utility in it, and maybe I'll go back now and write it for NAP, but no, I haven't seen that yet. Honestly, yeah, on a side note, in having compiled everything that I did for this talk, I'm wondering if I should ever continue on with NAP at all, because Django REST Framework does seem to be everything that I was kind of planning on anyway, almost. Any other questions, or are we out of time?
No more questions? Anyone? All right, thanks again, Curtis.
Thank you.